Okay, everyone, we're going to draw for the book from Dawn.
Gotta go out much, so watch out.
Okay, the number is 038516. 038516. Someone has to have
I'm doing good. How about you?
Okay, before we begin, I also want to remind you that if you have any questions throughout the night, raise your hand, and Ruben will come around with a microphone. We do this for 3 reasons. We want the speaker to hear your question, we want everyone in the room to hear your question, and we want everyone watching on YouTube to be able to hear the questions. Be sure to speak loudly and clearly, and we appreciate your cooperation during the question segment tonight. First, I'd like to begin with a prayer. And because it is the year of St. Joseph, I chose a prayer to St. Joseph for peace. St. Joseph, a man of peace and wisdom, teach us your way of peace. Protect us from the hatred and the evil that breed terrorism and justify it. Heal the brokenness that remains in many hearts. Release us from the bondage of fear and distrust of neighbor, especially the neighbor who is a stranger in our midst. Gentle St. Joseph, help us to be strong in defense of justice and care for the poor. Help our church to be the leader in the struggle for world peace. Help us to be generous and constant in praying for this peace. Amen.
Amen.
And now I would like to introduce Dawn Beutner. She is the author of Saints, Becoming an Image of Christ Every Day of the Year, published by Ignatius Press. She entered the Catholic Church as a young adult and worked as an engineer before becoming a technical writer. She, her husband, and her 2 children live in Northern Virginia, where she leads various parish groups that promote life issues, serve the needy, and learn about the Bible and the Catholic faith. So we're here tonight, Dawn, and
all right, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good, we're off to a good start. So first I want to thank the Captain Ministry people. Right, a little louder.
Yeah, speak a little closer.
Oh, speak a little closer. Thank the Captain Ministry because your people here have been so kind and wonderful. They made it so easy to do this. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me better? Better?
I think down more.
Down more?
Set them up. There we go.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, who knew? But first of all, thanks to all the people in Captain Ministry because they've just been so wonderful to get this all set up. My name is Dawn Beutner. My husband's family is from the area. I wrote a book called Saints, Becoming an Image of Christ Every Day of the Year. And the question that everybody asks me is, why did you write a book about saints? And there's an easy answer. As she just said, I'm an adult convert. I was a young adult when an amazing thing happened to me. I realized that there really is a God, and that He loves me, and that He died on the cross for me, and that changed everything in my life. I think they're worried about the sound. Okay, well, I'll keep talking. I can talk louder if I have to. And I changed my life, and I decided, eventually became a Catholic. But I discovered this thing when I became a Catholic, which was that every Catholic I ran into knew about a bunch of saints that I had never heard of. Like, who is Saint Christopher? Every Catholic knows who Saint Christopher. Anyway, so I had also realized that an important thing that Catholics are supposed to do is to pray every day. So I thought I would pray every day. And as part of that, I thought, I'll learn about a saint every day. I found a book called Butler's Lives of the Saints. If you've ever heard of Butler's Lives of the Saints, it's this multi-volume set of books with hundreds of saints. But this version had been arranged for one saint every day of the year. And I thought, well, this will be perfect. I'll learn about a saint every day when I pray. And I did that for a while until May 2nd. And I know this was my first time through the book, and I know this happened on May 2nd because St. Athanasius of Alexandria has a feast day on May 2nd. I had never heard of him before, but what I found out was Athanasius was the Archbishop of Alexandria, Egypt, which at the time was like one of the largest cities in the ancient world. It was like New York City or Los Angeles in the ancient world. So he was a member of a very important archdiocese. He was a brilliant man, a great speaker, a great writer. He was at the Council of Nicaea where we got the Nicene Creed that we all pray. And he was a great defender of the faith. There was only one problem, and the problem was that the emperor at the time was a man who believed in the Arian heresy, which is a false understanding about the nature of Christ. He believed that Jesus was not true God, he was just a lesser God. And Athanasius was a brilliant man, and he basically said, that's not right, and this is the right answer, this is the right explanation of who Christ is. The emperor was not happy about that, so he sent him into exile, which sounds so romantic and is so not romantic. What it meant was, he said, you leave the city of Alexandria and you don't come back. And then there was a hint of, if you do come back, we'll kill you, and if we find you, we'll kill you. So Athanasius was forced to live in the desert in Egypt. And this happened, and then political things changed as they do, and he came back, he was allowed to come back to Alexandria, then he was kicked out again. This happened 5 times. Over a period of 17 years, he was forced to leave his, now think about that happening to your bishop. So when I read this the first time, I thought to myself, if I were a man and a bishop and I were Athanasius, I'd have given up. I'd have said, God, clearly you don't want me to be a bishop because you keep kicking me out of my job. I mean, this guy's taking me to my job. I thought, I'll take up gardening, I'll do something completely different, but I would have clearly left it behind. And that's when the example of the saints really hit me, stopped me dead in my tracks, because I realized that we can ask the saints to intercede from us from heaven, and that's certainly true. But these saints can do more than that. They can help us look at our lives and at ourselves and realize what we don't have and don't realize we don't have. In my case, I realized you lack perseverance, Dawn. That he was inspired by God. He knew this was his job. This is what God was calling him to do, and he persevered because he was part of touched by God. So when we talk about saints, an important thing for us to step back and talk about is the fact that saints are not gods. They're not goddesses. They're just ordinary people like all of us. And as the subtitle of my book says, we want to become images of Christ, right? That's why Jesus Christ picture is at the top of the handout that you have. And if anybody wants, I have extra handouts up here. But the important thing about when we think about saints is they help us become like Christ. We can intercede for them to help us. An excellent analogy that you may have heard before is that Jesus is like the sun and Mary is like the moon. Have you ever heard that one before? So like the sun is a swirling ball of hot gas that gives off light and heat, right? And the moon is a rock. The moon is a rock that reflects that heat, that light to other people. That's how we can see the moon, right? So the saints are like that. The saints do not, have grace in and of themselves. They're not, just born with this grace. God gives them the opportunities to receive grace, and then they reflect it. That's why our Blessed Mother is the greatest of all saints, because she reflected the light of Christ most perfectly back to other people. So I would like to suggest to you today that there are many ways that we can learn from the saints, but the 5 ways that I'd like to talk to you about today are based on the saints who are listed on your handout. The 5 ways, one is through virtue, another way is through family life, the 3rd way is through sacramental life, 4th way is through prayer, and the 5th way is through Marian Devotion. And the saints that are on your handouts will go through them one at a time. So the first way is through virtue. So I've already talked about St. Athanasius. I think he's an excellent example of living a life of Catholic Christian virtue. I just gave you an example. You may remember all your virtues, the virtues that you learned in CCD. The four, get this right, I'll get in trouble because I know there are teachers in the room. 4 cardinal virtues are fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence. So I would say Athanasius is an excellent example of fortitude. That is, he was strong like a fork. He was unwilling to bend on these important issues. This is the truth, and I don't care if you threaten to kill me, I'm going to tell you what the truth is. I would say that he's also an excellent example of prudence, in that he had the support of the people. It was the emperor and his family members who were supporting Arius. He could have started a riot. He could have, tried to use some violent means of taking control and getting what he wanted, but he didn't. He was very prudent in the way that he explained the truth about Christ, and tried to do this in a way that was respectful of the emperor and rightful authority. Another virtue that I think he exemplified is temperance. So when he was living in Alexandria, in his diocese, he could eat with the most powerful people in the city. But when he was sent into exile, he had to live in the desert with monks where food was kind of scarce. So he was able to live as St. Paul did. St. Paul said that I learned how to live with plenty and with little. So Athanasius learned the same thing. There are many times that he had to live in the desert on very little. And then the fourth virtue there is justice. And I would argue that in justice, Athanasius knew that the just thing to do is to explain the truth to other people, whether they like it or not. It's just to explain the truth. Now, the other 3 virtues that we're more used to thinking about, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, I say that Athanasius exhibited them as well, that he had faith. And, we are all given faith when we're baptized, but we need to work at it. We need to understand it. So Athanasius was a brilliant man, but he studied the faith. He learned from other Christian leaders so that he could explain it effectively, so that when he was tested, he knew how to explain the faith in a way that moved people and annoyed the emperor. And then I would say that Athanasius had hope. For those 17 years when he was exiled from his see and he had no voice, he knew that even if he died, even if the emperor's assassins came to find him, the truth would come out, that God would be victorious in the end, which he was. And then finally he had charity. I would like to say that Athanasius at no time was ever strong in the way that he expressed his opposition to the emperor, but I would be lying. He told it like it is. He explained what was right, and then he was not meek and mild about explaining the truth about what was going on there. So he was charitable in that he continued to express the truth. So to sum up the example from St. Athanasius, we learn from the saints how to become more virtuous. So if you lack a virtue, you're trying to cultivate a virtue, you can look at the life of a saint sometimes and then draw a straight line. Oh, I could try this. This might help me grow in virtue in some way. So the second way that we can grow in sanctity and holiness is through family life. Now we know that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph are the Holy Family. But I think that we are sometimes inhibited because I will take a wild stab in the dark here that nobody here thinks that they have a perfectly holy family. We all, yeah, okay, that's the right answer. Everybody has some dysfunction and some difficulties in their family. That doesn't mean that you can't have a holy family. So, for example, St. Louis and Zelie Martin were the couple that are listed, that are shown in your handout. That's not my favorite picture of Zelie Martin. She's more attractive than that, but that's the best I could find on Wikipedia. Louis and Zelie Martin lived in the 1800s in France. They're the parents of Saint Therese of Lisieux, the little flower, Therese Martin, doctor of the church, one of the greatest saints the church has ever produced, and they were her parents. Being the parents of a saint doesn't make you a saint, but in this case it did. So they lived in the 1800s. Both of them, when they were young people, they didn't know each other. They had decided that they wanted to enter religious life. So Louis went to a monastery and Zélie went to a convent, and they were both going to become religious. But they were both sent home, and I've heard conflicting stories about why. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that they came back and they were not bitter and unhappy. They came home, they got a job. Louis became a watchmaker, Zélie became a lace maker. One day they were both walking on a bridge in opposite directions, and the rest is history. They met each other on a bridge. And then, so the rest, more of their story starts to sound like, oh, so perfect. So they had 5 daughters. I don't know if everybody has this. They had 5 daughters. All 5 of them entered religious life. Can you imagine that? 5 daughters all entered religious life. One of them is, the amazing Saint Therese. They lived a holy, devout family together. They went to church together. They prayed the rosary together. They were generous with the poor. They were generous with people in the religious houses nearby. They were just a lovely family. And that all sounds so perfect. But they didn't have a perfect life. So I said they had 5 daughters, and they did, but not quite. They had 9 children. They lost 4 children when they were small. The youngest one was just a few weeks old. The oldest one was 5. So if you can imagine losing a 5-year-old. And the other 2 were in between those ages. So they wasn't all infant mortality. But so they understood the loss of deep and profound loss 4 times. Zélie died of breast cancer. She is my go-to person for when someone I know is diagnosed with breast cancer. She had a long illness with breast cancer for a period of time. She went to Lourdes, did receive a cure, but she died so peacefully and just in such a holy way. It was an obvious learning experience for her children. They saw what happened to their mother, and they kept their faith despite this difficult time. And then, if you need to prove that Louis was a saint, he single-parented 5 daughters. Think of that. I think that should get you in heaven. But then Louis, at the end of his life, I've heard different descriptions. Some say, generally they say he had a mental breakdown, which I don't think means that he was schizophrenic. I think what it means is he had Alzheimer's, dementia, forgotten who he was. And his children, had to care for him as best they could. So my suggestion here is when we talk about growing in holiness and family life, it's not that this holy couple had just an easy life. They knew great loss in their life, but they trusted in God in the middle of all this pain that they suffered. They knew that God was always there, and for that reason, they are saints of the church. And we can do this, and we can do the same thing too when we look at our family lives. The third top group of saints that I like to think about is thinking about the sacramental life. And the young man that's on your handout is Blessed Pierre Giorgio Frassati, who you may have heard of before. Has anybody besides me heard of Blessed Pierre Giorgio Frassati? Wonderful. Okay. Blessed Pierre Giorgio was born in the early 1900s in Turin, Italy. He was from a very wealthy family. He had a sister. They were educated by nuns. They went to Catholic schools growing up. He was a very devout young man, but he wasn't what you think of as a devout young man. He had lots of friends. He was the life of the party. He smoked cigars. He was legal. He was, the picture that you see there is him on a mountaintop with his friends. They went mountain climbing together. He was going to become a mining engineer because he thought that would help him help people who were who really needed it, make it safer for miners. So he was 24 years old. He also had this great devotion to helping people who were poor and in need. So when people came, from the time he was small, if someone would come to the door and they needed shoes, he'd give them the shoes off his feet, clothes off his back. The money that his rich father gave him, he gave to the poor, to people in need. But he wouldn't just give away money, he would go and help them in person. and that is why he died. He was caring for a man who had polio. He contracted it himself. He was dead in 48 hours. So his parents show up at the funeral absolutely devastated at his loss, because his grandmother was very sick at the same time, so they just kind of ignored the fact that he was very ill. So they come to the funeral and they expect to see their family and friends. But thousands of people line the street leading to his funeral. And at the funeral and after the funeral, hundreds of people came up to his parents and said, "Your son was such a good friend to me. When I was in trouble, he's the one who helped me out and helped me understand what was going on. Your son was so kind to me. He gave me money so that we weren't homeless. Your son was so good to me. He brought medicine for my grandmother who was elderly. I don't know what we would have done without him." Just story after story that his parents heard. Now, the reason that I think Blessed Pierre is such an excellent example of the sacramental life is that he wasn't a priest. He received the baptism, confirmation, the Eucharist, and he went to confession regularly like all Catholics are supposed to do. He did just that. He just lived a good sacramental life and had this amazing outreach to the poor. And his parents had a very troubled marriage. They were this close to divorce. And his father was an atheist. So when his parents saw this outpouring of what their son had done, what a holy man he was, and they had not realized it, it caused a real healing in their marriage, and it brought his father back to the church. So my lesson for living the sacramental life is, we should do the best we can to live a good sacramental life and realize that we may not see in this lifetime the graces that other people receive as a result of us just living a sacramental life. Because Blessed Pierre Giorgio had no idea how this would affect his family. So the fourth way that I think that we can become images of Christ, looking at the lives of the saints, is through prayer. And if you have ever struggled with prayer, it's boring, it's hard, I don't get anything out of it, I have so many other important things to do, I can't make a habit of it. Saint Teresa of Avila is your saint. She is a wonderful saint. She's a doctor of the church, and she has a wonderful story. So she lived in the 1500s in Spain. Her mother died when she was a teenager. Her father thought that she was being a little too much like a teenage girl, and sent her to a convent school to be educated. But she loved life in the convent. She decided to become a Carmelite nun. And she lived a good life as a Carmelite nun for 20 years, for a good period of time. She attended, she was part of that family, the convent life, in a thoroughly unobjectionable way. Until one time, there was a moment in her life when she realized, with the help of some of the holy people around her, that she had not been praying. That is, she had been going to Mass and saying the rosary with other people, but she had not spent any time in mental prayer. That is, just sitting by yourself, listening to God and talking to God every day. That's all mental prayer is. So she made a commitment. She was going to, never give up mental prayer again, and she kept that commitment. She prayed, so just something as simple as just talking to God and listening to Him every day. And she's one of the greatest mystical saints of the church. So she reformed the Carmelite order. She founded her own Discalced Carmelite order of monks and of priests and nuns. She went all over Spain, founding and reforming religious houses. She was just an amazing woman. She wrote a number of spiritual works. And the amazing thing about St. Teresa's books about prayer is that you and I can read them. You don't need to have a degree in theology to understand Teresa of Avila. One of my favorite passages about her is that she was reading along and she's saying that she wrote these things, everything she wrote was under obedience. That is, the priest who was in charge of her spiritual confessor, her spiritual director, said, "I want you to write a book about this," or whatever. And so she would do it under obedience. And so she'd say, I wish he had not told me to write this, because there's important work that needs to get done in this house. I need to do some spinning so that we can have clothes for the nuns to wear. So she complains as she's writing these things. And it turns out the books that she's writing are the reasons that she's a doctor of the church. You know, they're beautiful works about prayer that are read in practically every language you can think of. So, so Teresa is an excellent example of, you know, how prayer, you know, we can all become holy and saints just by making a simple commitment to prayer. The fifth way that, and the final way, that I believe that saints can help us become images of Christ is through Marian Devotion. Pope St. John Paul II wrote, and this is my version, this is not what he said because he was brilliant. When he was a young man, he thought Marian Devotion was a little over the top. It was like just a little too much. Until he read a book by a French author, and that French author is the man whose picture is on your handout, St. Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort, who is not a doctor of the church, but I think he should be. So St. Louis lived in the 1700s, forget the centuries mixed up. Sorry, born in 1673 in France, and he was a preacher. He was a priest, and he preached all over France over, you know, simple things about, you know, living a Christ-centered life. But one of the main thrusts of his preaching was on the role of the Blessed Mother in our life. And he has two books that are particularly well known. And they're little books. They're not hard to read, like Teresa's books are not hard to read. The Secret of the Rosary and True Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And in these books, St. Louis says, Mary is like all of us. Mary is a creature, and God is a creator. God is a creator. He is all-present, all-knowing, all-powerful, infinite, and everything. All of us as creatures are just like an atom or less than an atom. But he says, you know, so Mary, on the other hand, but Mary is special in that when God chose to become a man, he entered into the world through her. And then he says this amazing thing, which I will not pretend to explain to you, because you can probably write PhD dissertations on it. He chose to become, because he entered the world through Mary the first time. God does not change, and he will continue to do so. So the way I would interpret that is at the end of time, somehow, I don't know how, Mary will be involved in the second coming. I would argue that perhaps that's the reason for Marian apparitions. That, you know, our Lord just keeps sending her back because that's, you know, her way. And also that the other thing is that this is not a Louis de Montfort analogy, it's mine, but I think it's in keeping with what he says, is that we say Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He's like the way to the Father. Well, our Blessed Mother's like a signpost. It's the way. That's the direction. That's what she's there for, just to point us toward Jesus. So St. Louis de Montfort and other saints are excellent examples of how the saints can help us understand another saint. So a question that I'm often asked is, why did you write this book about saints? So that book I told you, I got that copy of Butler's Life of the Saints that was arranged one saint for every day of the year. I read that book until the spine broke. I wrote it every day. I loved that book, and I'd buy another copy of that book. So then I found other books about saints, and so every morning I would sit down like 3 different books, like trying to find the saint that would most inspire me for the day. And there was finally a point at which I said, this is stupid. I'll just write my own book, and if nobody ever reads it but me, then I'll still be happy. I'll still have my book. So I created this collection of books of saints, and there were criteria I had for what I would put in my book. One of them is it had to be a saint or a blessed of the church. I picked up a saint book one time, and it had Mahatma Gandhi in it. You know, he's a good man in many ways, but he's not a saint. So every saint in my book is a saint or a blessed, canonized, officially saint or a blessed of the church. Second, I realized going through there that there were saints that weren't in this book, and it's because, like, for example, St. James the Greater and St. Christopher have feast days on the same day. So why should you have to choose? So I want to make sure that my book included all the major saints, all the saints that you think of, so that you're not leaving anybody out. I also, my children are young adults now. They think I'm kind of crazy, but I love the martyrs. And there's a reason for that. Because I wake up in the morning thinking, I have a really hard day in front of me. And I have all these things that need to be done. But you read about a martyr, and suddenly your day just does not seem that hard. So anyway, so every day of the calendar that there is a martyr in the church's calendar, there's a martyr in my book. There are only 3 days on the calendar that there are not. There's not a martyr on the church's official calendar. I think that's the only thing, yeah. So, oh yeah, I know other things we talked about. So for example, a saint that's in my book for today is Blessed Alexandrina da Costa. She was born in Portugal in the early 1900s. When she was 14 years old, she and her sister were being chased by a group of men. She jumped out of a window. And she survived, but she was seriously damaged, injured as a result. She recovered somewhat, but then she was bedridden for the rest of her life, like 20 more years of her life. She spent basically paralyzed. But she used this great suffering as an encouragement to draw closer to Christ, to offer up her suffering for people in need. She became a mystic in prayer. She famously, through prayer, she thought that the Pope at the time should consecrate the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and so she wrote him to do that, and a year later he did. So she's an amazing saint. So she's a saint, for example, a lesser-known saint you might not have heard of that's in my book. So summarizing everything I've said, so the saints can help us become like Christ. The 4 ways, like St. Athanasius, we can look at the lives of the saints and think about how we can grow in virtue, take practical steps to grow in virtue. We can look at the lives of saints like Louis and Zelie Martin and accept that the difficulties in our family life are things that we can take to God and trust in Him to help us face. The saints can help us through the sacramental life, like Blessed Pierre, to just simply live a good sacramental life and let the graces that we receive flow into the people around us. And we can recommit ourselves to prayer, the example of St. Teresa of Avila, other great mystic saints of the church. And when we need help understanding Marian Devotion, we can draw closer, pray the Rosary, learn through the lives of other saints. So one final story. And that final story is, there's a famous story from St. Thomas Aquinas. His sister asked him, how do you become a saint, Thomas? And she probably thought he was going to hand her a piece of paper and tell her to start writing down the 20 things you got to do to become a saint. And he had an answer, and the answer in English is 2 words. It's will it. Will it, yes, yeah. So if you want to become a saint, all the graces in the world, all the graces that God has are ready for each of us.